creating some guidelines on the identifiers in the context of DCAT-AP. Next slide, please. You know all the logistics of the webinar that usually hold during our meetings. We will kindly ask you to mute yourselves to write your comments into the chat. We will also have a poll later during the discussion. We will I'm Pavlina Fragu. My colleague Edvan Hulanda cannot join for the moment. And next slide, please. We are conducting this webinar because we received, we have a very fruitful discussions with DCAT-AP focus groups, as well as we see that the issue on identifier was highlighted into webinar, into GitHub, apologies, in the two discussion. Moreover, the identifier issue was discussed during our latest webinar, and then it was raised as a topic for future work. What is the intention of this webinar? The intention of this webinar is to discuss on how we can treat identifiers in the context of DCAT-AP properties, and to see whether we can find an alignment on the expectation of the usage of the identifiers, and whether we can find, we can reach out a consensus about the solutions. I would like to stress the fact that this the webinars are somehow different from the traditional ones that we are conducting on DCAT-AP, due to the fact that we are discussing, we usually discuss about the different topics, and our intention is, for example, to have a backface or minor release. Here is the focus is somehow different, to reach out a consensus with the community to see whether we can reach out a solution to tackle a very practical problems that was highlighted by the implementers as a very important one, and also due to the fact that this also applies to data spaces, which is an emerging field, and a field that we will tackle in the future. And now I pass the floor to my colleague Bert, so that he can continue the discussion and present it to you our possible approaches to tackle the identifier issues. Bert, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pavlina. So together with Max, welcome to this webinar. So as already introduced by Pavlina, we will talk about identifiers, and we will discuss and we'll guide you through it. Max will take care of anything what is on the interaction side and the timekeeping. I have prepared discussion points and try to explain as best as possible the points so that we have a good discussion with everybody around the table. If you want and to share and to get a follow-up as well, and you're new to the community here, you can leave a note in the chat with your email or something like that, so that we keep on tracking you and giving you feedback to future work, etc. As well, this webinar is being recorded, and this so that we can later on look back to it, and we can share it with the community for people that were not present during this webinar. Okay, then boom. So what we will do, and this is our agenda, we'll have first a kind of a state of play. Where are identifiers being used? What are the kind of use cases and the existing guidelines that we have today? And then we will dive into the proposals. And the proposals are it's very try to be augmenting and very precise so that we have a good discussion on it. And I will focus around our two key properties, DCT identifier and ADMS identifier, that are currently in the specification. And we conclude our discussion with a number of next steps. And that is the thing, the plan of today. So I will start first with a state of play to bring everybody in kind of a mood on where all the aspects of identifiers that we are dealing with. A first element in the topic of identifiers is just to raise awareness and to bring in mind that there are typically generic expectations on how an identifier should be represented and what it should be doing. This is expectations that we have, and I called it principles, but they may apply or not apply, but it's typically what we derive with identifiers as the form of representation towards. One of the first things is that we want that it is assigned by responsible of the entity, so that you know that this identifier somehow follows the life cycle of the entity, etc. And that this is as well identifying and that we try to be it as unique as possible, and that this is kind of an expectation or attention point. And this holds certainly in our case where we have many portals around, that the responsible of the entity, for instance, a data set, is not creating two identifiers for the same thing. And so that you try to use the same identifier identifying your data sets. So this is something that typically is in the mind set behind. Second element typically in the mindset is that we try to drive towards persistent identifiers. So not something that is just going away. We want to focus typically on the persistency and have some discussion on it. And people might expect persistency where it is not for some of them, etc., etc. So here, typically, if we deal with persistency, there's an attention point that identifiers should not be removed. So if we have these expectations on some of these identifiers, then they cannot be removed and they have to be maintained. And this is something that people should, or identifier schemas should take into account. And the last element that typically pops up in the discussion around identifiers is that somehow you should be able to go to the entity itself where it's referring to, and that it should be a mean and a supportive asset to retrieve the knowledge or to know what is the entity about that it's referring to. And it just has this kind of context that you know where it is, etc. And here, typically, if you do this practically, then there's a discussion what is kind of the best protocol to know, and then typically advices are use something that is universally known, like HTTP or HTTPS. This is just background. These are elements that will pop up in our discussion, but it's not the goal that we are going to discuss what is the best identifier and what are the best principles here. Just these are aspects that will come up in our discussion when we deal what is the value of DCT identifier or ADMS identifier. More related to that topic that we were going to discuss on the use cases, on the usage and the use guidelines of the identifiers is what are the use cases that we see for the identifiers. And the first thing that we should realize is that identifiers are introduced to facilitate processing, to make processing deterministic, so that you're sure that if you do things that you always get an expected outcome, that it's reliable, so that you don't get unexpected connections that you do not expect, that it's kind of reliable, trustworthy. It as well makes the processing efficient and even idempotent, in the sense that if you redo the same inputs, you get the same output, and that you can apply it over and over again. in the end to avoid making mistakes. So this is all these things are there. And it's good that we realize back that this is the reason why we introduce identifiers. There are other things and aspects of use cases that are important. It's as well that typically with an identifier, you have an intention that you want to have to give some ownership or responsibility to keep the track to it. So this is kind of typically as well another use case. With this identifier, I can find who is responsible, who is the owner of the entity very quickly, and I can start a discussion. Or I can support cross-referencing. So bibliographic cases, I want to refer that I have used this data set in my experiment, so I refer to it, I cross-reference to it. Or between data sets, this data set is derived from that data set, from this portal in that portal, etc. And as well, we want to have it kind of a stability in evolution. We know that things evolve, that information changes. For instance, the license scheme could be changed from a data set, or the number of distributions are changed, etc. So that you want to have then this kind of stability and have this aspect into it. So these are kind of use cases, more like from a business usage perspective, not from a processing perspective alone there. Then there's a third use case that's commonly in our cases, and that's we create a lot of portals so that end users can find and discover the data sets and the data services, etc., in a convenient way. And for that, we want to create a coherent representation of the information in our catalogs. And then we face, if you start implementing that, UI frameworks impose technical requirements on the identifiers. So they have some preference in the form, in the representation, and that might not match what we expect or what the intention is of maybe of a persistent dereferenceable identifier. So that might be conflicts into there, but we have to take care for that. So this is a use case that we want to take care as well. And finally, this is one of the most complex but most important cases, is that we do not build a portal or a catalog on its own. We want to share the information that is in the catalog from one portal to the other portal. And this is what we call as the process of harvesting, so where we aggregate from different source catalogs into a new catalog, and that we're going to present to a new community or wider community. And if you look deeper into what harvesting does, then you might have some expectations on it, and this influences our usage of identifiers. So the first aspect is that if we harvest information, then the harvested entities, the harvested data sets should be easily retrievable in the aggregation. So it should not be a very complicated process and querying aspect to find out what was a source data set. It should be kind of easy. Second thing is that we should try to avoid that harvesters have to impose cross-source requirements like disjointness. So saying source A and source B, you have to be disjoint. You cannot have the, descriptions of the same data set. That is very difficult to maintain, and we should try to not have a situation that this must be imposed in order to work to get aggregation and harvesting properly done. So to look towards solutions for that. Another formulation of that is that if we harvest and aggregate, we should not be the harvested catalog should not be leading and to contribute to the creation of new duplicates in the network, because a harvested catalog and aggregation is as well in its own right aggregated and harvested with another catalog, and then this gets a complicated network. And if then by that creates duplicates, then all of a sudden we have only one, from one description that pops up many descriptions of the same data set. And then, yeah, we don't know how to deal with that. And that's, we have to be careful in that. Another element in harvesting is that we should be careful that harvesters do not claim ownership of the sources. So in the end, it's the master data management perspective that data sets or data services are owned and maintained by the entity that is owner or there, and that it's harvested or catalogs should not try to claim we are owning it. So somehow identifier should facilitate in that you can go back to the original element and the original source, and so that you can go back to the origin. And finally, and this is kind of a processing and an operational aspect on harvesting, it's, since this is kind of a critical element in our network, it should not be overly complex. It should be cheap, it should be easy to be done, and it should be, in that sense, expected, getting expected results, both for the dataset owners, so they do not have to copy the information in different portals, but at the same time for harvesters and aggregators that they do not have to deal with duplicates or complex alignments, etc. And so that's what I mean with cheap in this aspect. And in this, if you look to it, into our current perspective and of the portals, if we look to the European data portal, then we know this harvest national data portals, but often there is already this connection with the geospatial data portals, and the interaction between the two is maybe direct, indirect, through the national portal or direct to the European portal, and this might already get duplicates or complex interactions. But there are as well other portals like national access point portals, which are oriented towards transport data. And this creates a kind of a complex network, both at a member state level or at a thematic level and at a global aggregation level. And it is very hard to control this network from kind of a central perspective. So we should be able to facilitate with our guidelines that this network can grow at a very nice way without too many problems or organization that the network must be organized in a particular way. If we look to today, and this is a slide that was already in the previous webinar in October, where we shortly touched upon on the GitHub issues, and we initiated the discussion. And you can find for the same data sets or the same service many different identifiers, portal identifiers, persistent identifiers, and somehow how do we can make that this is all the same and they point to the same thing, and then we can find the source back, so that users, no matter which portal they visit, no matter perspective that they take, can reach and say, okay, actually I have used this and it's the same as this one. Yeah. So this is the goal in there. For that, so this is a setting of the use cases. You might still think of other use cases, but at least I think with this set, we have covered quite some of the challenges that we are already dealing with. And to conclude the state of play, I just want to remind us that in the past, indeed, there are existing guidelines written try already to tackle this issue, but we think with this webinar, the voting or discussion and a community time to it, that we can improve those guidelines and that we can get a better result than the ones that are currently available. And our discussions, and this is towards then our first discussion, We'll focus on two properties. So we have in our specification two properties, DCT identifier and ADMS identifier, where DCT identifier has as range a literal. So it's a simple notation of the identifier, and whereas ADMS identifier is a complex notation with context information. And if we look to the usage, and we see still quite some usage of DCT identifier on ADMS identifier, then yeah, this is a more open approach, but it's not very often being used or immediately being used. So the usage of ADMS identifier and what to deal with it is not being maybe optimal used. And we have some proposals in discussion that we can may make use of this ADMS identifier. And then as a third, we should not forget our main sharing platform data representation is RDF. And in RDF, there is as well an identifier and how to deal with that and how this relates with these two properties. That's a topic that, depending on the perspective on the usage of, for instance, on DCT identifier, might have a choice and an influence how to deal with that. But let's first align and discuss on what the usage of DCT identifier and ADMS identifier can be and relate with RDF. Okay, before I'll jump into our discussion, is there anything, Max, that's from the state of play that we should note or discuss now?
There was one comment from Andrea Perigo. First of all, that use case could also be explicit data citation, which is part of the cross-references.
Yeah.
And also, Andrea says that identifiers might have a role in the timeline, or let's say the evolution with versions. And I think that's correct. I don't think we're going to handle that here today, but certainly that is also an aspect that could be relevant for identifiers.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
But those were the only two comments in the chat.
Okay. Andrea, I see you have raised your hands.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry to we are going also to look into another one, which is all same as, because this is actually another option for identifiers.
We're not going into that today. I think
okay.
We can note that. That's a good point.
Yeah, we don't go into that indeed.
Yeah.
We have not considered that aspect and let's say alignment across identifiers. Let's say which identifier is the same as the other one identifier. That's a topic that we're not going to discuss.
Matthias had a comment about the EU rights dataset in RDF, but that is something that comes back in the discussion later.
Yeah, that comes back. Depends on well, it comes back.
Yeah, comes back. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, good. Then, what is our approach? We do the following. We will try to introduce a particular discussion topic, and you will see next to it on the top right corner in the blue change. That means that it is affecting substantially the specification, in the sense of that the outcome will be an update on the usage note or on the cardinality, etc. Or no change, it means that it might be a rewording of the usage note, but still in the same spirit and an improvement, but actually has no major impact. And in order to do that and to make a decision, then at a certain point, some slides have discussion point block as well underneath, and that's a point where we'll have the discussion. So it might be that the point is introduced in 2 slides or 3 slides, and then there will be a discussion slide to facilitate the discussion. what we have prepared as well is a bit of a flow and a decision track. We have two discussions on DCT identifier grouped. Then on ADMS identifier, we have proposals. We have topics around where to apply the guidelines that we agreed to during this webinar, and then in the end on the alignment with RDF. So this is the flowed-out of topics. But when we prepared it, we saw that the first point and the definition usage note of DCT identifier is kind of critical and determines the discussion what follows after. And therefore we have a yellow path and a blue path, depending on the choices that the community makes in the usage notes. And based on that, we have proposals on the subsequent topics. So we will spend, therefore, the first discussion is kind of for us critical today, and to see where the community tend to in a more yellow or a blue case, and so that we can have a good discussion for the next. Otherwise, we might always come back to difference in opinion in the subsequent ones, and you cannot make good guidelines or good decisions, for instance, on cardinalities. So that is the flow. And so this is the topic. If we look to the proposal and to the usage note of DCT identifier, then the sentence says this property contains the main identifier of this entity. And for instance, e.g., or this is the URI or not any other unique identifier in the context of the catalog. And there is some ambiguity in these two sentences, because the main identifier, that I call it here blue, is points towards a value assigned by the owner or the publisher of the dataset, whereas the yellow points to a value assigned by the catalog. And this usage note makes it then hard at the definition what is the best approach and what is the let's say the common interpretation by the community. And that's where we want to discuss upon. We have two assessments made, and if we follow our assessments on the yellow and on the blue, then we can state that the yellow one results in a coherent view in the catalog, but if we apply it, it creates a big impact on today's way of working. Many data set descriptions will be affected, probably all of them, and it impacts harvesting because it means that in the end, you have to do changes in the values of DCT identifier, because it is a value that must be assigned by the catalog, and the older one cannot work. So this is kind of, we don't want, I think this is a good effect to do this, all this kind of changes. It as well might get a complex alignment process to make cross-referencing work, certainly across portals. So this is a big impact if we want to use that definition. But if we then look to where the benefits are, it's indeed mostly to the catalog, but not for the network. And so the network comes later. It might still work, but it is still challenging. And then the blue line, if we follow the blue line, then we think that there's less impact, but creates much more clarity, creates a direction and a focus that publishers and owners are incentivized to do good identifier management, and that this is much more allows us to create a network-oriented solution and that we still can, with the additional guidelines, support the catalogs. So that's the introduction, and I already saw hands raised.
Yep. Matthias was first.
Yeah.
Matthias?
Okay, so there is an assumption going on here that the identifier is for the dataset is in DC terms identifier. And I have always assumed that the identifier of the dataset is the URI of the dataset. And there is an optional, I mean, the identifier, DC terms identifier, is not a mandatory field. It's an optional or a recommended, I don't remember. Therefore, from the perspective that we have done in Sweden, is that the identifier of the dataset is always the URI. And from that perspective, it's unproblematic to have the yellow interpretation, that the identifier that you provide in the DC terms identifier field is something that is unique within the context of a catalog. So what you are, from the way you are phrasing these two options now, seems to be that, no, this is not the case. We are saying that the identifier of the dataset is in this DC terms identifier. I just want to point out that this is not obvious, at least not from me, and I don't think everyone have had that interpretation from the start.
I think that's correct. I think what that was also saying is that in the yellow one, the DC identifier is going to change because the catalog, the harvester, is another catalog that needs to assign another identifier because it needs to be unique within the catalog. That's, I think, the point that is being made.
That's in the point, yes.
So I see what you say, Matthias, but in practice, the way that the yellow is defined, a harvester is required to change the identifier. And I think that is exactly the problem that some people do and other people don't. So what we're trying to do in the webinar here is to find a solution that actually works for everybody.
Just a comment, I don't see that this is a requirement that you change the DC terms identifier.
No, it's not a requirement, but it's what some people do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, all right.
That's what the problem that we encounter.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's as well, indeed, Matthias, I agree in the sense that if there is, that's another thing, the RDF identifier, and that you have assigned this URI, that one is plays a role in the future of the harvesting, and you want to have that this is treated properly as well. And there were other comments, Max? I think.
See Bart saying blue is the best, and Jesper says DCAT-AP Germany uses the blue way, but does not allow to assign a new DCT identifier if the dataset already contains the DCT identifier property. So that's the way that Matthias says that the interpretation in Germany is that you don't change the DCT identifier. That, I think, is one of the approaches that we have seen.
Yeah.
Any other questions on the two with the also the evaluation that Pat just said, where the yellow one is something that is that probably would require everybody or many people to change their ways, and the blue one where we think that, and we have of course proposals for each of those to actually explain why there is minimal impact and maximum clarity, and also how we can get to network benefits. Any comments there? Any things that people don't understand there?
Yes. May I talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. I don't know if I've understood properly, but because I'm thinking in a specific use case, which is the federation of datasets between data portals.
Yeah.
And I don't know to what extent any of these solutions is actually solving or tackling the problem. Because if you don't have kind of a alignment between the way the people is creating the identifiers, how can you guarantee that they are unique?
Yeah, and that's something I think in the proposals that we are coming to, we're trying to explain what it means and how it actually becomes coherent and understandable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's
I think it's an important part. Do the proposals actually solve the problem that we identified? And we think it does. But that's I also have, I think, Bart. Bart, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, some practical things. I think we all agree that an IRI should indeed be the identifier, but in practice, what's the issue is that while blue definition should be the best, in practice it's the yellow that's being used, because quite a few platform and document management systems just create an identifier. So it's not very. I think it's a blurry thing. It's not going to be one solution fits all.
here. May I answer? I think even the blue does not exclude that a catalog will assign identifiers.
No,
it's
true.
not excluding that. That's not excluding that. The
No.
thing is, what it says, the yellow is very strict. The value of DCT identifier must be the value of the that is assigned by the catalog, no other.
Yeah.
And that's a very different interpretation than it may come from the owner or publisher of the dataset, and it might be the first catalog that assigns it in that process. So the blue is more relaxed in that sense. It doesn't claim that it's the only one coherent in the catalog. That's the difference between blue and yellow.
Okay.
Are there any other questions to needs for clarification on blue and yellow?
Maybe I could just say a few words about what I just typed in the chat. What we do is that we keep an identifier for a metadata record in the portal.
Yeah.
And that is distinct from the identifier of the dataset. So we produce a new identifier whenever we harvest datasets, because we basically create metadata graphs or name graphs, which we have identifiers for. You could argue that that identifier could use the DC terms identifier provided from the dataset, but that just would be a suggestion as a way of having a nice URL. You could also take the dataset URI and do an MD5 sum of it or something else that would be unique.
Yeah.
So I just don't see that there is a necessary that we have to talk about identifier for datasets in portals, that they are identifiers for the metadata records.
Okay.
Okay, so and if I'm understood you correct, Matthias. So it means that you create an identifier when you harvest. Oh, can you explain?
Yes, yeah. We have to have in the portal. You have to have sort of a landing page for every data set, and the URL to that landing page has some URI, have some part of which is an contains an identifier, but that identifier is not an identifier for the dataset. It's an identifier for the metadata record for a dataset.
Okay, it's the catalog record.
Yeah, could be the catalog record mechanism, but it's not always that we have catalog records. So, but we will always have to have some kind of identifier for the graph holding the information for the dataset.
But I think what we've seen is that people have different ways of doing it. I think the problem that we have identified is that because people are doing differently, it's very hard to have any expectations of what an identifier means, because in Sweden it's different from in Germany, and therefore the idea that we are presenting here is that rather than using that interpretation that catalogs create identifiers and just replace identifiers as they go along harvesting, and go back to trying to find a way that the value assigned by the owner publisher dataset is still visible. Now, in the proposals that we're doing, we're not using only DCT identifier for that, because we found out that it's very hard to do that, because then you would actually have problems of current implementation. So what we are doing in the proposals is to use ADMS identifier to create the linkage between identifiers. But I think the first question that we have, and I've seen several people, Germany, Switzerland, and I don't think more, that people see the blue line as the better line, so that there is actually in the proposals a link back to the identifier of the publisher, rather than having changing identifiers in different catalogs. So the question is that we're having now, because we have prepared sort of a line of proposals for the 2 tracks, and we wanted to select one of the tracks so that we can dig into how we think it could be done. I see a hand from Jesper.
Yeah, I would like to add, in Germany, we use the DCT identifier for detecting duplicates in the national portal. I'm not the expert on how this deduplication is done, but it's especially for geographic data sets, it's quite difficult process, and this process relies on the unchanged DCT identifier assigned by the publisher of the dataset, because it appears in different portals, a dataset. For example, a dataset from my federal state Schleswig-Holstein appears in the national mobility platform, and this mobility platform again is harvested by the national open data portal. So my datasets from Schleswig-Holstein would appear twice, and this this deduplication algorithm uses the DCT identifier assigned by my publishers to detect those duplicates. And it wouldn't work if one of the catalogs would assign their own identifier.
Yeah, and that's a problem, or that's a side effect that might appear if you're not careful, because you can take, even in the yellow, some precautions that it could work. That's the reason why we have as well prepared. There are possibilities in there, but you have to do much more work in the case of the yellow than in the blue compared to the current.
So Bert, do you want us to move to the poll, seeing whether people want us to follow the yellow line or the blue line?
Yeah, I can. I saw that Christian raised his hand that is just open, and otherwise.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to underline what Jesper just said, that we are at GovData, the national German portal. We check the DCT identifier and also the DCT modified date to check about the duplicates. And what we are figured out so far is that when we are doing like kind of a mapping from ISO metadata, for example, to DCAT-AP, it's hard to, we have to have strict rules, and it would be really hard for us to tracking the duplicates with changed identifier. So yeah, we would prefer the blue one.
Okay, we saw that Hagar.
Hans makes a comment also that in the Netherlands they use the unique catalog identifier and then a global identifier, and I think that's one of the things that we're trying to come up with also in the blue line.
And Hagar has raised her hand too.
Yeah, sorry, just to be clear, because I see from what I was following from the discussion that the RDF about which we kind of left out is used differently by different publishers. So thinking of a portal that actually harvests the other portals. Would it be correct to say that when it isn't the RDF about is perceived as a main identifier, it should be duplicated as a DCT identifier as well, if we go with the blue choice?
We come to that at the end, at some point in the discussion.
Yeah, that's indeed how we can fit the two together. We have in both sides, we have a plan or discussion points.
But I see most people that have responded many people are in favor of the blue line. So can we just, because we have to choose which one to follow, can we do a poll on seeing what line people want to follow so that we can explain what we think that either of those lines can deliver?
Yeah, and as you see on the next, yeah, so there should be a Slido indeed appeared to your case, to your screen, and based on the outcome, we will follow blue or yellow, and if it's really undetermined, so if we are too close to each other, then we have a backup line.
Let's wait. And I see, and currently I have 91% blue, 92%, 93%, 94% blue. 18 in the chat window, Hans. If you under the chat window on the right hand side, and on the bottom you have a Slido button also. If you're on a, can you see that?
No. It's supposed to be.
Oh, sorry.
On the bottom line on the right, you can see a button for chat, participants, and Slido.
Slido.
Oh yeah, sorry, it was hidden here.
Yeah, if you click that, then you get the Slido.
Yeah, but you can only vote yellow or blue.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can only have yellow or blue. And then what we have on the slide here, if we have a 50-50, then we are going to the bottom one, the orange track. We're hoping to get a clear outcome for yellow or blue. I think we're already, like with voting, we already say that for 28, we're about half the people have voted, and we're still at 89% blue and 11% yellow. So 28 people have voted. Anyone else want to vote? And then we'll move on.
Nina raising her hand, Max.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm new to this community, and I have one question. If I'm a data owner and I need to publish a data set, do I pick a particular catalog where I publish my data set, and this data set needs to be distributed among the rest of the catalogs? Or if I have a data set and I need to publish it in 2 different catalogs, I need to use the same identifier that I have selected? How it works?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, in general, what we're the community here are portal owners, so people who actually have providers of data sets. So it's not that you are a data set owner and you just want to look for a for catalog. But yes, in fact, if you have a data set, you probably have a relationship with the catalog, for example, a regional portal or a national portal, and then you submit that. And the idea of the blue line is that you need to create an identifier for it, which then becomes an identifier that stays together with the description of the data set. So that is something that the blue line says, as we said, the identifier is assigned by the owner of the data set. So that's the basic idea. Yeah. Does that help you?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, so you have 29 votes and we have 90% blue. So I would say that we have a clear outcome for the blue line. Bert.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So that I'll tick then on the blue line.
So we're going blue track.
Yeah, we're going to blue track. Okay, on the blue track, if we look, then I'll zoom in on DCT identifier, and we take the perspective that this is assigned by the dataset owner, publisher, and so on. And if we look today, there is the minimum cardinality of 0. If we want to enforce it, if we want to change it and put it to 1, then we are going to enforce dataset owners, publishers to provide a value. Now, the question is, do we want to do this? Do we want to change this? Do we want to enforce it? If we currently look to the query on data-europe.eu, and I also saw that only 50% roughly has an identifier, DCT identifier. So it will be creating a substantial impact on the publisher community to enforce it. So this is what the impact will be. On the other hand, of course, it is kind of a good practice and to incentivize publishers to do it, to create a good identifier. So the question is, and then our proposal at the moment is not to change it, to keep it as is. But of course, you can recommend in your own context more strict and to go ahead with your publisher community to enforce it. So that is our current proposal. We say, okay, we can leave without it. It is not necessary to do it, but still advised. Are there?
Maybe you want to do the second slide as well.
Yeah, okay.
That's related to it.
Yeah, can do. Oh, sorry, the second slide. The max cardinality, if we impose this to 1, so that's the other perspective. So it's not the minimum, but then the max. So because the usage node currently states the main value assigned by the owner. So either we change the usage nodes and say a value assigned by the owner. That can be plural. Or either we introduce the max cardinality 1 because to align with the main value. So there are the 2 options here into it. Either it's a max cardinality to align with the intention of a single identifier, or either we say there might be still multiple identifiers, DCT identifiers, but it will be the ones assigned by the owner. Maybe they have multiple ways to assign identifiers and you want to share it on DCT identifier. So here's a bit of the change, either in the usage node, either in the cardinality, and this as well is raised as an issue on GitHub.
Because currently the cardinality is 0 to n.
0 to n, yes.
So it was restricted to 1.
So I saw Christian passing by.
Christian?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, for us in Germany with DCAT-AP, we would speak for changing the cardinality to 1, because as already mentioned, we do the duplicate with the DCT identifier. And we have another rule which says the first rule is don't change the DCT identifier. And the second rule is if you want to add identifier, use ADMS other identifier. So for us, it's really clear, and all the data providers can handle it very easy to say, okay, DCT identifier, we take it from the original one, don't change it. And if we have another identifier, we just add it to ADMS other identifier, which is also 0 to n. So there could be several other ADMS other identifier, and because of that, for us it would be good to change it, the Max Cardinality, to 1 for DCT identifier.
And the point on ADMS identifier we get to in the next slide. Okay.
And I saw Anya passing by. I think.
Anya?
No, sorry, I just agree to what Mr. Wittich said.
Okay, good. So this is something that people would agree to. And we'll note that down, and we'll always come back to the proposals at the end if you think that something is incoherent. Germany says 1 is okay. Switzerland says 1 is okay. So let's then move to the next one, Bert, if you want.
So I think Hagar passing.
Yes, I think actually for us it would be not okay to have a maximum cardinality of 1 because we do use more DCT identifiers.
Okay. So you would need to see how that affects the work that you do.
Yeah, it would have an effect.
You
I would keep
mean
it 0 to n, but no.
okay. So let's see how at the end of the discussion, what do you feel about that? In all cases, I think it is clear that changes may need to be made because this is a change in the specification, and
Yes.
we need to look at what the.
Yeah, and if I understand correctly, Germany was saying that basically they use ADMS identifier to address it. So basically, the need to have more identifiers is obviously common, and the way we use ADMS identifier would not allow for that. So I guess the whole discussion still needs to be.
Okay, so but we get to ADMS identifier and how we propose to use that to actually make it coherent.
Yeah. Is there other things in the chat or?
Yeah, Hans says it would be nice, but we need to say something about 2 authentic identifiers, and I think we're not saying that. We're saying the owner of the dataset, the creator of the dataset, is responsible for creating 1.
Yeah.
So if you have more than 1, then we can go to the proposals for ADMS identifier, which allows in our proposals to have multiple. So, but the idea is that at the first point where a dataset is created, the owner creates 1 identifier that can be used throughout. So let's, and Alberto only says 1 is also for him. So maybe we can go to the ADMS identifier proposal so that people have a complete picture of.
Okay.
Sorry, can I ask one question?
Yes, sure.
We said that there are 50% does not have a DCT identifier, so we are not changing the minimum.
No.
But what about I think there are a few, I'm not sure, but probably there are a few data sets already have more than 1 DCT identifier.
Yeah, that's.
What should we do with them?
That's indeed also the question that Hagar had in the publications office. They use more than 1, and that's something that I think we need to analyze. Our proposal is to make it 1. So if there are cases where there are more than 1, people need to do something about that to select which one is what we want to be the main identifier. And then in the whole proposal, we try to explain what the effects of that, the positive effects of that are. So I think in any case, we cannot, from the specification of DCAT-AP, say that people must do things. If we create this restriction, we need to also provide a way of, let's say, gradually implementing that. And it's also here on the bottom here, it says that this gradually can be enforced, but people will need to do something. So that if people don't do that, then we don't gain anything. If people are willing to do something, then we can gain the network effect. That's the idea.
Yeah. the thing here, either we have to change, let's say, open up the definition, the usage node. But if we want to stick to the notion and the main identifier, the main value, then it's natural that the effects on the formal representation is as well one, because otherwise we come back to the discussion in a year's time. Then people read the main value and then they see n and they question why it's n.
Yeah.
So that's the thing as well we want to resolve.
I got again.
Yes, sir. No, I was just thinking maybe if I give one concrete example, it will help explain how come we sometimes have more than one DCT identifier. So speaking of Eurostat, for example, they don't have a DCAT catalog, but they do have a platform, of course, for managing statistical data. And each data set has an identifier. But the first time when they actually get published data sets following DCAT is when they're harvested onto Data Europa. And there they are assigned with a persistent identifier. So these are both, in my opinion, equally important identifiers of meaning the same thing basically, but it's hard it would be hard to make a choice in the.
No, but there could be a choice, and I think that our proposal is that that choice should be made to create consistency across the network. But just let's go through the next part of how we envisage the use of ADMS identifier to meet those goals. And but we're note that in the case also what Simon said, if there are implementations that use duplicate or more than one DCD identifier with different values, then certainly there needs to be an analysis of which one is the main, which is in effect what the usage node currently said. There is a main identifier, and therefore we need to the data owner needs to select which one is the main one. Bert, do you want to go through the next one for ADMS identifiers, or maybe the picture becomes more clearer there?
Yeah, so the last point on the value, it says in the sentence of DCT identifier, and then we can close the whole story on DCT identifier, is that the expectation on the value. And there's a suggestion in the usage notes to use URI and IRI, and we propose to maintain this suggestion. So to use let's say a properly managed IRI as suggestion, but not to change furthermore to say enforce it. It has to be one. So we would like just keep the value as is, assigned by the publisher, incentivize it, the publisher, to use a properly managed IRI, and that's it. So that would be just to close down on the expectations. So we have min cardinality, max cardinality, and the expectation on the value string. And here we wouldn't change anything in the chain, in the setting. So we have still something open then of a discussion on the max, that's clear, but for the rest, it would be improvements on readability of the usage nodes.
Okay.
Sabine?
Yes, I just want to say that first, sometimes it's a little bit difficult for the publisher. If the publisher provides the identifier and it should be unique, then the publisher itself needs kind of an identifier. Like in Switzerland, all publishers have an identifier on the Swiss data portal. And so they kind of provide the identifier in two parts. And one part is like their internal identifier on their platform, and the other part is kind of the identifier of the publisher. But on the European, on the European ground, they wouldn't know. I mean, if they wouldn't have been told that's your identifier, then they wouldn't be able to make unique identifiers that can be harvested to every other data portal. So I think that's kind of a problem with this blue approach a little bit. And the second thing I wanted to say is like the if the value should be the IRI, at the value on the other hand is a literal, it's also a little bit kind of a contradiction sort of in my mind.
It's the representation, and first of all, indeed, DCT identifier is a literal, so we cannot change the structure of that. That's one of the challenges of DCT identifier, and that's the reason why we actually have so much difficulties to deal with it. That's one. Secondly, on your first comment, in the end, if you say I create a metadata record about describing my data set, and you have to create an identifier, and you say this identifier is only to be used in my catalog sense and nowhere else, then that is kind of fine. But if you think in the perspective, this is going to be shared across a network, and I don't know how it's being used, then I think the creators or who is in charge of assisting publishers to create identifiers should incentivize that publisher to think in the broader network. That's the assistance that we done. And then URIs or any other schemes that creates globaler or more global identifiers come into the picture. And it's not a natural reaction for somebody who is just describing its data set. That's a topic for those who are in bringing the description to the network. So
let's say there's an issue there of how to create that first identifier. I think that needs to be on the list, because some people would automatically, and I think in Sweden, for example, automatically create a URI for a data set. But in other cases where people may be in an XML environment, they would have more difficulties to do that. But I think let's put that as a separate issue. How do you create this properly managed IRI is something that we cannot solve here, but I think it's something that we might need to create a smaller guideline for.
Okay, well, we have all hands tackled, Max.
I see Sabina and I see Matthias again. Yeah. Matthias?
Okay, yeah, so I think the recommendation in the DCAT-2 says that you are supposed to, if you can, use not blank nodes, but URIs. And I think the DCAT-AP is a profile of DCAT, so I think that's the way we should go. If you have other systems that don't necessarily expose this in RDF, they should still follow this guideline by having URIs internally, or when they expose them to RDF, if they do. And generating such URIs will probably not be an issue in general, because every system have identifiers internally to manage the data sets. They will definitely have that. So if you export to RDF and you use blank nodes in the place for data sets, that's, from my perspective, just sloppy behavior. It can be done with URIs based on the internal IDs that are probably stable. For instance, systems for a geodata domain, they have UIDs that you can use. They actually have 2 per data set, one for the metadata record level and one for the data set level. So I think this is perfectly manageable to rely on the way that it is supposed to be in DCAT, what DCAT-2 says, and we should just repeat that statement in the DCAT-AP new next specification.
Yeah, so but this is aligned. This is aligned, so we cannot enforce. There is a difference. If you want to enforce it, then we do a change. Yeah. So this is the difference here. So it's just maintaining as is.
Yep.
That's.
But it's clear. I think what we hear here, there is also a need to have some guidelines or some information about how to create these persistent identifiers for each of the data sets. And I see Alberto also making a point that there needs to be a way to make sure that there is some logic to generate identifiers. And that might be different in different places, but I think the rules for creating identifiers could be written down in a guideline.
And most important to that is that these rules can be easily implemented by the DMS makers. Yeah. Because otherwise, if we trust, let's say, in kind of a manual or ad hoc procedure, I don't think that most of the small portals are going to adopt it. And if they are not adopting the thing, all the castle will be broken.
Yeah.
Because imagine that only 50% of the portals adopt this, then we are doomed. We need to go for the 100% or 90, 99, 95%.
Yeah. Okay. So, but the point is that we can only encourage people to do things. That's the situation we're in. If you're an implementer, then we would encourage people to do it that way. And that's. I also see Sabine still their hand up, or you have it again, the hand up, Sabine?
No, sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so then we can
suggest to move on.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Bert. I have my hand raised.
Sorry, Andrea. We didn't saw.
Yeah. No problem. No, about the previous slide, I think that will be important to clarify why it should be an IRI. So, which basically are the use cases for DCT identifier? Because if it is just for detecting duplicates, so identifying records, then this is not necessarily a requirement. If you have a UUID, this is unique irrespective of whether it is a URI or not. If it instead is also meant to be used to go back to the original catalog where you can find some additional information about the data, this is another story. So besides saying how to do that, we should probably make it clear which is the purpose of DCT identifier and why it should be an IRI.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just a recommendation, but then it is not clear why I should use it in that way. I mean, why you need to mint an IRI, whether if I can do this otherwise.
Okay, that's a good proposal, Andrea. We had it in the use cases, since of one of the first.
The principles, one of the principles.
No, not the principles, but the principles one, and then a use case. Second slide on the use cases indeed mentioned that it's going back to the owner or back to the original metadata record. That's probably something that we indeed could add as a main kind of use case for why URI series are recommended.
And if I may also, it would be interesting to know from all the data providers that are using the DCT identifier according to the blue option, whether they are also using it, for instance, to point to the original page of the catalog or not. So why they're using it? Is just for detecting the duplicates or not? Because otherwise, putting this requirement in terms of which is the syntax for this identifier may create troubles. So I don't know if it's something that can be understood in this context, or in any case, I think should be investigated.
Yeah. So one of the other things is that, and this is maybe another use case, is that the life cycle of the data set is known by the publisher. So if the publisher decides for whatever reason that this is actually a different data set, it should be a different identifier. And that's very hard for somebody else on a catalog harvesting to know. So this is something, indeed, another use case for having a properly good identifier.
No, I understand that. What I'm saying is that in many cases, I mean, when you're looking at the current situation, where the European data portal, in any case, multiple catalogs harvesting other ones. The point is that in many cases, the metadata that are published in another catalog are not as rich as the ones that you have in the original catalog. So it can be for domain-specific metadata like the geospatial ones, but also others like research data. No? So each catalog maybe implements the profile in a different way. Maybe especially generalistic catalogs may not include the information that is available in more domain-specific or discipline-specific catalogs. So that may be a requirement to be able to point to, and actually this is something that European Data Portal is partially doing. I mean, so there is an overlap in these two things because I think that they are not completely the same. One thing is to say I have an identifier that helps me detect duplicates. Another thing is I ensure that this identifier is also the referenceable and actually is a persistent URI is not going to change, because it's going to change, then it does not make any sense to point to the original catalog. So I think that I see this as two requirements that are overlapping for sure, but in many cases may not be addressing the same purpose of a DCT identifier.
Okay. Yeah, it is indeed. We are overlapping in that. Okay.
Let's move to the ADMS identifier to make the proposal clear.
Yeah, because this is something we want to propose to you and to promote a bit of the use of this ADMS identifier in a way that the network can take benefit from. And it's done in the two proposal stages. One is on the catalog itself, and stating that because DCT identifier itself is contextless, you don't know who has created it, you don't know who is maintaining it, you don't know the responsibility of it, you just know the string of the value of the identifier. That's what it is. Whereas ADMS identifier knows the structure, knows who is responsible, you can discuss about it and you can deal with it. So our proposal is that whenever a catalog or a publisher creates an identifier, that's actually, it should be using ADMS identifier, repeating, potentially for the publisher repeating it, but for catalog maybe adding it, an ADMS identifier, and I have used this identifier, I have created this identifier. This is the proposal to do with this. So this is a change for ADMS identifier in the sense that we promote the use much more and want to create that this is much more visible so that we can reason on the identifiers. That the long debate we have before in the sense of it was on the format, how many, who, and there's a lot of maybe some context and etc. This might be resolved if we publish the identifiers in ADMS identifier with sufficient context. And then based on that context, there can be rules by that publisher, and it might be not dereferenceable, it might be dereferenceable URI, the intent might be different. So that is the proposal to do. So the impact as such today, it's very limited in the sense of DCT identifier is not touched. It's just adding information. So it is very low thing, and it might assist and to have a note, for instance, if you as a catalog that is assisting the creation of a collection of data sets, then you might say, okay, I as a catalog create as well an identifier for you, and if you're not happy with it, but anyhow, I create and make sure that it's available and that it can be shared through the network. So that's the difference between that you can distinguish it is assigned really by the user or it is assigned by the system that is assisting the publisher to create the metadata.
So we get around the problem of the DCT identifier, which doesn't allow any context.
Yeah.
If you have a complete URI, then of course the context is implicit. But in the fact that ADMS identifier allows you to provide metadata about the identifier, who created it, when it was created, then it actually clear throughout the harvesting process what this identifier represents. That's the idea. Do people agree that that is an approach, sort of adding ADMS identifier as a way of creating that coherence and that stability across the harvesting? I think Jesper is putting his thumbs up. If people think about that, is there something that people immediately say, this is not going to work, or people want to support that? No, it's not the proposal to replace it. It's the proposal, Sabine, to add it.
Yes. So we add this advice, this more strict usage note saying, okay, it's highly recommended, it's recommended to introduce for every identifier the necessary context of who has created it, who is maintaining this identifier, etc.
And a couple of others that we come to later. Yeah. Bart says a good. Hans Overberg. Everybody seems to have. Well, it must have a data type on stas notation.
Is that a requirement? So what are the available data types? I haven't checked that.
Stas notation is a literal at the moment.
Yeah, but in the DCAT-AP specification, the data types are taken from the data site data types.
Okay, so there is a well-controlled list of them.
There's a well-controlled list of that. We might have to see whether that list is completely is complete, but there is a link to that in the DCAT-AP specification.
I'm just saying that it might be more complicated than to fill in the ADMS identifier if you have to select the data type corresponding as well.
Yeah, the goal is to at least to put sufficient metadata context around this identifier. That's the proposal.
Good point, Andrea, Matthias' point to look at the data types is one thing that we need to do.
Yeah. Okay, are there other hands raised?
I say everybody. Alberto, you're absolutely right. It's actually what we want to do. We want to actually, as Jeff says, encourage people to do that. The question is how far we can go to make people actually do it. I think what we do is we have a proposal that we hope would encourage people to do it. And I know that you're in a different environment where you have more power to make people do things, but that is something I think is not what we're talking about today. But you're right; it needs to be done to create the network effect. That's
yes,
correct.
Because I've looked at Scott notation in other settings, and I always stopped because I couldn't use it because I didn't know what to expect to put in the data type. And that frustration, so it has to be very clear, otherwise no one will use it because they will just leave out the data type.
That's a question of the guidelines, I think. I
Yes.
see Andrea, I see Sabine. Andrea, first.
Yeah, no, okay, so what I was thinking is probably that to make clear the difference between the DCT identifier and the DMS identifier as described here, maybe we can use the notion of primary identifier and alternative or secondary identifier. This is also what is done in some metadata standards like DataSite, where they support one primary identifier, which corresponds to the identifier that now, according to what has been decided, will be assigned to DCT identifier and the other ones.
Yeah.
And
actually, what we're saying, Andrea, is not to make that statement of what is primary and what is secondary, but for every identifier, who created it, so that if you find those, you can actually determine what you want to do with them. I think it's been always very hard to identify saying what is primary and what is not primary, because people might have different ideas about that, and we want to get away from that. So identifying what it is, rather than whether it's main or, for example, what we say, one of those identifiers would be in the metadata, you would see it's being assigned by the publisher. So, and that is the one that, and it will stay across all the harvesting. You will still have that one. You see what I mean? So rather than having sort of a value of whether it's main or secondary, I think it's better to, in our case, our proposal is to actually make clear what it is.
Yeah.
Who assigned it.
Okay.
Yeah, and
That's
so
clear.
that indeed if you collect and aggregate data, that you can make some informed decisions and how things are connected. And if if it somehow gets a growing set, and there's a bit of this discussion that you said we are not going into in this all same as. In the end, a catalog gets a collection of identifiers associated with the entity and can decide for its own what is the all same as relationship it wants to follow. That's what we want to facilitate, that information is available. Today, things drop away. That's the goal.
Yeah, my question was just like for the original DCT identifier, would it be like that you want metadata, provide metadata by taking the same value again in an ADMS identifier? So then the values need to match, right? It's an additional statement.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. So for
Okay.
every, but but it might be more than one ADMS identifier. Right? There might be, you might have a DOI, and you might have your catalog identifier. You might have a data site on or references in somewhere. So there are multiple ADMS identifiers. But what we ask is that the one in DCT identifier is also described. So it's not just the notation only.
Yeah, and why is it not good to replace it then, like the DCT identifier by an ADMS identifier? Because I think to find the matching value further described is also hard to validate by Shackle, for example. Or isn't it?
So then we come back to what is the meaning of DCT identifier. That's the reason why I started the discussion there, is that if we just say there are lots of identifiers, just a collection of identifiers available, then ultimately the question comes, what is the one that you want to offer to readers of this metadata, of this data set, saying, okay, if you want to refer to it, yeah, preferably use this one. This is the one that is to be used. And this could be then, now with this interpretation in blue, the one on DCT identifier.
Okay, I get it. Okay, thank you.
So this is kind of the selection by the publisher of the owner of the dataset. If you want to refer to me, please use this one. It's not an enforcement, but it's it's an indication. That's where the things match.
I have one question here on the chat from Nina, to go back to the previous slide for a sec. Can you do that? Nina, what was your comment here?
Thank you. No, I just want to make sure that I follow and I understand the fact that we are going to have always, okay, this is the recommendation first, always have DCAT ID restricted to maximum 1, and then we can have either now about the cardinality of the ADMS, either 0 to many or 1 to many identifiers for the data sets. This is the only thing I wanted to have a look at.
So I think, Bert, if I'm correct, what we're proposal is that at least you have one ADMS identifier, which is the one that is shown here on top, but it is repeatable for any identifiers that are created along the way. So it's 1 to n.
Thank you.
it will end up into 1 to n. In the practice, it will be 1 to n. Yeah.
Okay. I see Sabine and I see Andrea. Sabine? No. Andrea? Andrea? No? You? I can't hear you, Andrea.
Yeah, sorry, I was unmuted as usual. I think that it is important also to look at how ADMS identifier is currently used. Actually, I think Jesper pointed to a record on the European data portal. So, to my knowledge, at the moment, at least, the ADMS identifier used mainly by metadata about research data when using DCAT-AP, and is used in order to specify persistent identifiers like DOIs or other kinds of identifiers. And this applies also to persons possibly that are included as contributors, because they may have an identifier like the ORCID, which is used by researchers. And we have already, I think, a good example with quite a few metadata, because the ones available from Zenodo, so this platform run by the CERN, that is basically the biggest research data repository in Europe, is providing also metadata according to DCAT-AP. Yeah. And what they use there is a mapping from DataSite that use exactly the ADMS identifier for this purpose. So it would be worth also looking into that, because there may be also other examples.
Yeah, that's correct. What we try to do with our proposal to include existing cases of ADMS identifier, although, of course, we would ask people to be clear on who, for example, in the metadata of ADMS identifier, to provide some minimal information that we also hear at least who created the identifier is part of our proposal. But you're right, we can have a look at what is already there and see whether that is in conflict or we need to have additional guidelines for those cases. I think that was...
Yeah, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because it seems that DOIs are increasingly used also for data. I saw that there was some comment also from Alberto in the chat. So we can also point out that the ADMS identifier is the option to be used when you want to specify a DOI associated with a data set.
Yeah, that's indeed. But that's a goal. We want to capture every possible identifier into it so that it can hook up. But additionally, as Max said, who has assigned it or the ownership, so that it's not only just a string. So I think if we just have a collection of SCOS notations, then we will not gain the value. Right? The value is with metadata.
And I have some comments from Sander saying that we are trying to keep provenance with the data set itself. And I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to do a minimal, as you say, you're doing lineage of data sets through Prov-O records, but that is something that not everybody does. So in the way that we're trying to do, taking into account what people do with identifiers currently, provide a way to make sure that you know what the identifiers are and who assigned them. And we're not going to restrict anybody to use Prov-O to do more than that.
Yeah,
but
indeed.
we're looking at a minimal way so that it's clear what an identifier is. And that is basically what the problem is currently, because it's not clear what an identifier is about. So that I think it's clear that we cannot keep all the provenance in identifier. We shouldn't try. And if you have more requirements for provenance, you can use Prov-O. But this is sort of a minimal proposal that might help to understand what identifiers are about.
Okay.
But we're using up more time than we expected.
Yeah. Okay.
So 15 minutes late. So let's go through and then gather questions as we go along.
Yeah. Okay. So but it's good. So it means we are as community concerned and want to get a good result.
Yeah, of course.
So what happens is this is the same proposal, but just in the context set of the harvesting use case, because that is a specific use case that is commonly happening. And if we would apply it, then you could say we introduce something that's called harmonized identifiers. I introduce this term to denote the following. So when you have a source catalog that is being harvested into an aggregation, then yeah, typically we would like that the statement of this data set with this identifier is repeated in the aggregation, that you can find that. But what we propose now is to say, okay, in that context, actually, you do some additional efforts as a harvester, because typically you have a portal associated with your aggregated aggregation, so with your harvested collection, and that you publish as well that identifier as an ADMS identifier. So that it means that you start with our first proposal, say in the catalog itself, this identifier is as well in ADMS identifier, that's the left. It's copied over, top and bottom, and in the middle I have added now this harmonized identifier by the aggregator. Saying to illustrate the proposal that along the way of harvesting, new identifiers are added and concatenated to the list of ADMS identifier, but being passed on to the network. That's the objective. And for the rest, nothing is changing to the data set itself. So it's an enrichment process of the data set, or the information about the data set, a minimal enrichment process where we say, okay, on the ADMS identifier, we know it has been created by this aggregator, and it is now in this form, and it is the optimal form for this portal.
Okay.
That is the proposal.
Yeah.
So yeah, the discussion slide is actually exactly
actually
the same thing. There's no change. So if there's any questions on this?
I see Fabian.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So now one of the developers of the European or Data Europa, and we have the philosophy that we do not change the actual metadata of the dataset, because it makes us much easier to reharvest. If we would add such an identifier, we would check this and merge it with possible updates and so on. So we usually do such things if we do them in the record or in just a very special field which we skip in harvesting. But like this, it would be very complicated to do this on a big scale.
Is the case, Bert, maybe, would it be possible for the aggregator, in this case Data Europa, to not add ADMS identifier for their own identifiers, but just use what is coming from the catalog?
What we do, we create our own identifier, but we don't store it like this. We just make to describe very easy. We just take the catalog as the scope, and then the ID of the original catalog, and in combination, it's a unique identifier. But we don't store it like this.
So you don't store sort of the second thing, the second on the right. You don't store that. You just keep what comes in.
Second on the right, we don't. I don't know. Simon is here. Simon knows better than I do, but I think we store it implicitly.
But you don't have to do it, I think. Bert, is that correct?
Well, the thing is that it's actually you communicate the harmonized identifier, because if you go to your web portal and then the user, the URL that you see of the data set, that is the one that you have created, and that's what people are going to communicate.
But may I ask the question, what is the purpose of all these identifiers?
The purpose is that identifiers are currently being created, and it's not clear what the identifiers are. The idea is that we create extra identifiers, ADMS identifiers, to make clear what the identifier is. Because that was the problem that was raised, that it's not clear what an identifier is about. So that's
I think it's about the dataset. It's just an identifier for the dataset.
Yes.
I think we do make things more complicated as necessary, probably.
Well, yeah, one of the issues is we're trying to solve the problem. If people say that there's no problem, then we don't have to make this proposal. But that's the question. We think that currently the situation is quite unclear, and we're trying to make a proposal that makes the situation clearer.
Mm-hmm. But if we end up with, imagine that there comes, the data set moves along the path through different aggregators.
Yeah.
Yes.
The list will be more bigger and bigger.
Yes.
Exactly.
I don't think that that's helpful for someone or for anyone.
Yes. No, actually it is. It is because this one I have to scroll. Sorry, now I have to go back. I'm not going to jump all the. You know the list. You have seen the list of the identifiers in the initial slides of all the portals of the one data sets. In order to know whether or not this is the same data set, I actually had to do and to query every portal manually because I knew it should be there and I have to find it, search it. I couldn't do it simply just based on an identifier. I had to hunt and do it. And this is the proposal that by adding this information as an aggregator, you become machine processable. Okay, I can find the link back. I can query it. And that's it. Nothing is changing. So we don't change real metadata. We only note the aggregator has added a new identifier for its own best purpose for serving it. That's all what it does. That's a proposal. And nothing more. And that's another one can handle. Indeed, that this list is not becoming longer, but that's actually the case what it is. On every portal, they have a new URL being created. And how do you know that this one is the same as the other? I don't know. But with this one, with this proposal, we are able to find and to have the links in the data and not anymore by trying to match, I don't know which properties.
I see Nina has her hand up. And Hans was first. Sorry. Hans was first.
I first thought it was a good idea to add this identifier, but I was guessing what does harm mean? It's harmonized identifier, and that sounds like an enriched identifier. That sounds like a better identifier than the original identifier D1.
The harmonized, I mean, is the identifier that is optimal for the aggregator. So if you do the aggregation, typically you have a UI framework. I don't know which one, and that UI framework says the optimal way to make your URLs and your front end is using integers as numbers. So how do you going to represent and make that mapping? Then you do something internally. You make that integer associate with that data set.
No, that's not my point. That's not my point. I know you need, as an aggregator, you need your own identifier because you might have clashes. But the message that you give should be that the identifier D1 of the original catalog is the best identifier, is the global identifier. That's the one to use.
Yes, indeed.
When
That's
we exchange. And by saying that the identifier that the aggregator gives is the harmonized identifier, the message sounds like this is a better identifier.
Okay. The reason I used this harmonized is just the term that it is harmonized across the whole aggregation. It's technical. It's not an assessment of the quality of the global thing. That's not the meaning.
That was just a warning I wanted to give.
Okay, good. Then
and I also want to link that back to what was said for the European data portal. They don't actually record that in the metadata. They just do something that is the aggregator environment, and they keep track of their own identifiers and they don't actually expose it. So that's some other way of doing that is not actually creating the extra identifiers within the metadata, but doing that out of band. That was another thing that was done by the European Data Portal. I see, Nina had a hand up.
Thank you. Just to make sure I correctly follow the conversation. So in a situation, if I am a data catalog provider and I'm harvesting a data set from another data catalog, the description of the identifier should be the identifier given by the data owner, the DCAT ID, plus 2 additional ADMS identifiers, the one that I'm assigning, the identifier assigned by my data catalog, plus the one from the originator, or I only stick to the one that I have aggregated. And the subsequent question is just to reconfirm, you're not suggesting that each data catalog that is harvesting a data set from one data catalog is represented all the harvested or all the aggregated identifiers. Is that correct?
The proposal is first that an harvester will not remove data to the outside world. And certainly on the identifiers, I would not remove data with sharing the data as is. Would be losing potential of the next one to use the data. So that's a premise in this assumption in this proposal, so that it's not going to remove information, it's only adding information. And the proposal is to add the outcome of your operation of aggregation. What is that? That is one of the key elements, is assigning yourself identifiers, which are stable, unique, aligned in a particular form, optimal for your aggregate catalog, that to share that as well with the outside world. That's the proposal. So it's augmented with one ADMS identifier.
I see, Bert, in the chat also discussion taking place that people think that, no?
Yeah.
Go to next, this one, no? That one.
So,
yeah,
sorry.
that, no,
yeah,
that one. That not to add this aggregator identifier. That if the aggregator needs identifiers internally, it will keep them away from the metadata and use some other process, but not expose it. So that in fact, throughout the whole chain, what happens is that what is stable is what you have on the left-hand side. And that is created through, and that actually makes it clearer what is happening. And you don't need those aggregator identifiers. That's what people seem to be.
But then is the question how you know, that is the thing, is that how you know from other portals that it's the same thing. So
because you have this thing on the left-hand side is what everyone creates, what everybody maintains.
Okay.
Original identifier and one ADMS identifier that says what it is.
Okay.
Then we are relying on this this original identifier to be unique, and but it's contra-intuitive. I mean, the intuition is that when you aggregate, you make again unique identifiers, so they are globally unique. So we have to stress that the original identifier is somehow taken care of, that it is globally unique. So it should be a URI or a
it should be persistent and unique. Yes.
But then that's the impact. That means that if you indeed say that is this D1 must be, there's a strong enforcement, and then we come back to the discussion that a D1 must be a URI globally unique, and then it has big impact on all our publishers, because many publishers do not have it. That means everyone has to do more work as a, let's say, from a data perspective person, I would love to have that. But
well, it's
I'm not
actually
sure.
already in the recommendations of DCAT-AP to do that. So
Yeah, but many do not do it. It's
Yes.
not.
Also
many-
consider that it's already solved. I mean, this problem is already solved. I mean, the data portal in Europe is already have identifiers. They have managed to handle this already. So let's try to make recommendations that improve the current situations. And we have this, ways of solving it. For those that don't have it, we have solved it already, but let's phase them out.
I have a question, if I may.
What does it mean, phase out that, Matthias? Because that's
provide strong recommendations that every dataset should have a unique global identifier, a URI, in the subject position of the triples. You can have it as DC terms identifier as well. It doesn't matter, but still we should have it. And if you don't have it, the portal harvesting today already have a mechanism of assigning identifiers to them. And that's unfortunate because it should be provided further down the chain. So
yes,
good
that's what
that's
where the thing is. It's currently, if somebody up in the chain adds the D1, the URI, and then starts promoting it and giving it away, and then then it changes potentially the identifier or the identity, and it creates duplicates. So we have to avoid that. This has to be then really on the bottom part of the chain.
Okay, but that's part of that could be part of a guideline. I see Hagar had her hand up.
Yes, sorry, I wanted to ask, but would this if using ADMS identifier property like that, would that mean that it's no longer of the range ADMS identifier, the class? Because there you would need a registration, scheme agency. I mean, it was originally, we do use it for the European publishers, for DOIs, and there it's interpreted as a strong external identifier. It's I mean, it will not violate it, but it's a very big move from the current definition and using it as another way of storing what I would normally see more in the DCT identifier field property.
The thing is, so there are two things that you mentioned, Hagar, into it. One is that your interpretation of ADMS identifier says it has to be a different identifier than the one in DCT identifier.
Well, it has a range, and this is from DCAT-AP. It has an ADMS identifier range, so.
Yeah, but the class is describing meta information about the identifier. It's not the second thing is, do you interpret it that the collection, the values that of all the identifiers there must be disjoint from DCT identifier?
Well, it's defined. I mean, if you look at the ADMS identifier class, it's an external identifier, and it's maintained by a scheme agency, basically.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying, in the sense of, do you see that it can be overlapping or not?
No, it can be overlapping. I'm just saying it's a very big move from how it's defined now to how you would intend to use it. I mean, we can keep using ADMS identifier for our DOIs, but
sure, that's.
But would you be able to define them as of the class ADMS identifier? I don't think so.
Yes, why not? I don't think ADMS identifier is a super. It's meta information about the identifier. That's all what it is. Yeah?
Well, it requires to be data typed with specific. We have to check which data types
you have to
are
think
included,
about
but,
what is the metadata, of course, that is associated with it. I agree with that. That's
you need this normally the scheme agency. Yeah, I mean,
and that's part of that's part of the part of the definition already. Yeah, sense of it's just not only the SCOS notation, because if it's just a collection of SCOS notations, you don't gain a lot. You just have identifiers, extra notations, and you don't know more. So what we're saying is, in our proposal, is use ADMS identifier with context, with information that makes and assists users to make decision on the identifier, not just on the value, not on the string representation. And we don't want to inspect the string notation. So say, okay, if it starts with data Europe EU, then we know it's managed by the EU. No, I don't want to do that. I want to do that. I want to be able to say on DCT creator, it's this value, this URI, and I can decide on it. That's managed by, created by Zenodo. Okay, I know it's managed by Zenodo. Then I'm happy. I can make a global decision, but not by parsing and to get into involvement of the notation. That will be very difficult. Huh? That's I don't want that we do.
Bert, can I interrupt here? We're actually running out of time. We only have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
So I wanted to make sure that what we need to do is maybe have a second webinar where we discuss because we had another 20 slides with pieces of. So is that something that we can? Are people interested in continuing the discussion? I think we have a couple of things that came out of the discussion so far that we need to actually look at particular issues that people have brought up of current situations and how to improve it. Some pushback against some of the proposals that we have here, for example, on the screen. And then what we should be doing is change the proposals based on people's comments today. And then have also, there is a couple of other issues that we want to have. For example, what exactly the metadata for ADMS identifier would be. So not just those two, notation and creator, but also other things that would help deciding on what you want to do with them. We also have the issue of how those identifiers relate to the RDF graph identifiers. And I think we probably need another hour or hour and a half to talk about those. Is that Pavlina? I see you nodding.
Yes, I think that I agree with this. I think that we receive very fruitful information. I would propose to send the report to the stakeholders so that along with the contain the proposals that were presented during this webinar so far, along with creating the necessary some GitHub issues, so in order to give the opportunity to people that couldn't attend to provide their feedback, and I will propose based on today's discussion, along with the feedback that we will receive from other stakeholders, to continue the discussion, having as a basis, this as a basis, and rearrange this, continue the discussions in order to meet to come up with a conclusion.
Okay, so I think that's then unfortunately we couldn't get a complete agreement on the proposals, but I think we have a real good discussion. We have some good suggestions to make things not more complicated than they need to be, and I think we need to think about that and come back with adapted proposals. Bert, is that something that we could do?
Yeah, sure, we'll do that. And I think indeed this was a good lively discussion, trying to look from different perspectives, let's say from implementers, from experience, etc., and bring this all together. That's what we should do. Yeah.
Okay. But thanks. We're over time now. I see people already leaving for other meetings. I will get back to all of you and to the rest of the group with a proposal for a new webinar, and then also with a typing very hard with further proposals for discussion. Yep.
Thank you. Right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
people from the team, shall we set up another meeting to discuss the outcome?
Yeah, okay, yeah. I'll invite, I'll send you an invite.
Okay, good.
Okay, good.
Okay,
Bye, everyone.
thanks, everybody. We'll discuss.
Florian and so on, you keep the, you close the recording, for Alexander.